Okay, so today we're going to be going over our third section here, which is the Salesforce Flows Pause element. So what we want to do and what the whole idea behind these segments are, or this playlist, if you found it on YouTube, is to go over every single thing in the flow that's available for us to use, so that way somewhere out there in the Salesforce community, we have a couple things. We have this really simple way that element works, or that specific thing in a flow works. Usually what I tend to find, and what has been difficult for me as I've been trying to learn more and more about Salesforce and over that time, is you'll find a video, probably, like, I'm sure if you Google it, I can't be the only one putting out one on pause, right? There's got to be more out there. But typically what I would find is that you would look it up and you got this just crazy canvas. You're looking at this canvas and it's got, 50, 60 different elements on it. All this huge process going on. And you'll look at it, and if you were like me, especially if you're brand new, you look at this thing and you're like, I have no idea what the heck is going on with a flow. That's kind of the reason I'm Googling this. And then two, I get it. Like, thanks for the help about showing me like that specific element. But typically I'm already confused by the time we get to the element because of all the other crap that's going on in there. I don't understand it. I don't get like the business logic. And then I would also see a lot of the times, like, all these different things are happening that it's not really specifically highlighting that one element that I want to see functioning, so that I get a clear understanding that would resonate with me to say like, oh, okay, that's how that element works, right? So that's kind of like the purpose here is, I'm not interested in trying to get into like a huge business use case scenario. I'm sure we all have them, like, from our jobs that we could try to do, but like, the idea behind it is just to put this content out there to teach people that are trying to learn flows. Like I just explained, for me, it was difficult to find some of these different elements in just a single video on that specific functionality. So that's kind of what we're doing here. And we'll go over all this kind of stuff in just a second. I just want to remind you, if you haven't been to any of these videos, we do have, I should say, a blog site or portfolio, if you want to call it that just has all this different information on it. So I post fairly frequently, trying to get a lot of content out there, posting a few times a week. So because of that, I added in the subscribe form this week onto the website. So if you're interested in keeping up with stuff like this, feel free to subscribe over here, and that way you'll be notified of anything that we put out on our website. So we have anything from Salesforce stuff, thing we're reviewing right now, which is a flow, to functions and all that good jazz. Then we have things like business applications. That's your Slack, your Zapier, your DocuSign, Tableau, stuff like that. We also have a podcast called Head in the Clouds. That's on like any major platform that you listen to any podcast on, Spotify, all that kind of stuff. And that one's specifically focused more on like our FAQ around Salesforce. And this week, we're actually going to be kicking off a thought segment, and we're going to call it Unfiltered Thoughts. And basically, it's just going to be a segment where I'm going to try to write a little more openly and have a candor discussion around things like, navigating your career path, and trying to post more content and trying to share your opinions more on stuff like this. And then basically just kind of how I'm choosing to go about that. And hopefully that's helpful to people. So feel free to jump on over here. I do have some credentials around me in case you care. Find me on LinkedIn and all that good jazz. The biggest takeaway while we're on this site is that every single thing that I post on YouTube is going to have a blog site. So much like we have this Salesforce Flow Decisions, you click in here, it's got screenshots from what I talk about in that video. It's got the basic breakdown on what was talked about in that video. So if you're more like myself, where I would prefer to probably watch a video once or twice and then just look at the documentation and build it myself, versus trying to watch a video and then remember like, oh yeah, at 2:13 he talked about this, or at 5:16 she mentioned this part of it, and trying to find it in the video, that's kind of bothersome to me. So feel free to jump on over to the blog if that's you, like you're not really interested in the video. We'll have one for this one we're recording right now. So feel free to jump on over there right now because we're going to jump into all this. All right. So we got a lot of that out of the way here. So let's go over what we want to do with this specific element today. So we got this thing called a pause element. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you haven't. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear it? Like the pause element? Probably something like it's going to stop the flow in some specific area, right? Or it's going to temporarily hold the flow from doing something. Like there's a pause somewhere, right? And that's exactly what this does. It's pretty cut and dry. And in our use case to show the functionality, it's going to be super simple to hopefully understand and see that functionality happening. So the pause element, like I said, it does exactly that. It's in a use case like the one that we have here. If you want the flow to temporarily be paused or held for a certain amount of time or until a specific thing happens, you'll throw in a pause element so that it will pause the flow from just going through and running the entire thing. It stops it, and then after that pause is done, it can move on with the rest of the flow. So in our business requirement that we got here, completely made up. I'm just trying to kind of mimic something I've had to do a little bit, like loosely in the past. So let's read through that. It says, finance has asked that we wait 24 hours between when we get a new account and when we activate that account. This will allow the finance team to manage their queue and SLAs accordingly. In other words, what we want it to do is we want this flow to be kicked off when something happens. We don't want that flow to just completely finish and run all the way through. We want there to be a pause for 24 hours, and then we want something else to happen, right? So that's kind of what we're going to mimic today. So what our criteria is, we're going to have a couple fields that I'll jump over and show you here on our test account. But basically, we're looking at a field called active. And if that's changed and that field is also moved to the status of yes, then we want our flow to be invoked and move the account status that I'll show you to the status of queued. And then after our pause, move it to activation. So let's jump over there and make that more realistic for you. So I typically always use Lightning, but for these demos, it's a lot easier for me to use Salesforce Classic. So I'm in the Salesforce Classic here. And on our test account, the Pizza Planet test account, let's look at those fields. So we have the one that's active, right? And there's a yes or a no. So in our whole made up scenario here, our sales users, when they're ready to activate this account, they come in here and they move this active field to yes. Once they move it to yes, that's when we want this status field to be changed, because the sales user, as we know, they are going to want to know when their account, their opportunity is ready to close one. They want to move on with the process and be done with it, right? That's like admin 101 right there. So what we want to do is a couple things. One, we want it to get moved over into the status of queued to activate. So as soon as they click this and move it into yes, we want this status to be moved into queued to activate. And this status here will make sure that it's a read only. So nobody can, tamper with it. It's just like more of an admin type field and a notification field. So the sales users won't be able to tamper with it. And once they move that to yes, like I said, we're going to move this to queued so that they know, okay, this thing's teed up, it's ready to go, it's in the queue, but it's not activated yet. Our finance team still had that 24-hour time period. They're not ready for it yet. Like, we still are waiting on this thing. Once the 24 hours is done, or in other words, once that pause in our flow is done, then we want another update to occur so that this can be moved to activated. That way, everybody knows by a notification standpoint, they can jump into this account and say, okay, sweet. It was the 24 hours. We're ready to go. It's activated. This thing, is ready to move forward with. I can do whatever it is that I need to do at this point. So that's what we're trying to do. Those are the fields that are going to be involved in this process. So hopefully that makes a little more sense. You get a feel for what we're trying to do here. Now, the flow design is going to consist of a few things, right? So a word of caution found on Salesforce's help site is that they're stating you must have it as an auto launch flow. So in our case, we have it as an auto launch flow, but just make sure that if this is something you want to incorporate and you haven't built it out yet, it looks like it has to be an auto launch flow from what Salesforce has said. So we have this auto launch flow. If you don't know what an auto launch flow is, it's just a flow that's kicked off by some other process automation. So our other process automation that happens in this case is the process builder, the account process builder. So on our process builder, on the account, like I said, we got this little node guy down here. Active is changed. And it's looking at those fields that we just looked at on our account, right? So active equals yes, and active was changed. That's true. So it's looking at those two things. Those are the conditions that are met. If those two things happen, go ahead and get our pause flow going. And then you got this thing over here called a variable, right? And if you're not super familiar with variables, I'm sure we're going to get to this sooner than later because I've had a few people message me after doing these videos to try to make time to go over variables because those can be very tricky to start understanding if you're new to all the flow kind of stuff. So as a quick little rundown, a variable, the way I like to think of it is kind of think of like a box, right? Like you got this box, in other words, that you're putting something inside. So think of the example I like to use. Think of a Christmas box. You have Christmas decorations. What do you do with that box? Well, you pull out like a piece of tape or you grab a Sharpie and then you write on there Christmas decorations, right? And then you throw it back in your shed, you throw it in your back room, your attic, whatever. And then next year comes around, you go looking for the box that's literally labeled Christmas decorations and you pull it out and you take out the Christmas decorations. A variable is very similar to that. And that's why I like to think of it like a box because it's just a holding place. It's just something that you're putting values into. So just like a Christmas box, you can name these variables whatever you like, right? So we have our box or our variable titled record ID on the flow. Well, what do we want to put inside that box? Well, if it's the record ID, then we want to grab the account record ID and put it in there, right? And that's what this is doing. So when we want this flow to get called, we want to tell it, okay, this is the account that was just affected. This is the account where active was just moved to yes. And that's the one we obviously want to update. So that's why it's important for us to grab that record ID so that we can match it up with everything else in the flow. And say, okay, great. That one just got shipped into the flow. So we know that one is the one that met that criteria we made up and is ready to get updated, ready to have that pause element happen on, all that good jazz. So that in just kind of some short words is hopefully a better idea of what a variable does for you. So that's what we're doing. We're shipping in the record ID variable. Cool. All right. So it's an auto launch. We reviewed the process builder together, and now let's just kind of go over what we want it to do in the flow before we jump in and actually start building that. So a couple things, right, we mentioned is we want it to update the account status to say queued first, and then we want a pause to happen for 24 hours. After the pause is done, we want it to update once again so that status equals I think what was it? Activated. And then that way we know that it's ready to go. So those are kind of the three elements that we're going to throw on our canvas in the flow and how we're going to build this one out. All right. So I've wasted a crap ton of time before by, trying to build these out, recorded on a first take, and then like just crossing my fingers that I didn't do something stupid and it works. So I already have these kind of built out for the reason that I tested it. I want to just make sure it works before I recorded it. So I'll go through these elements so that we have the context needed. And we all understand together like what's going on with it and how the pause element is used within a scenario like this. So it's an auto launch flow. We reviewed that. We're shipping in our variable over here, which is that record ID. So the very first one we want to do, as you saw, we want to hook it up to our update records. Reason for that is the very first thing we want to happen, right, is that account status to be pushed to queued for activation so that our sales rep knows it's been teed up and it's waiting that 24 hours. So that's what we did in here, right? We grabbed our update records element. We specify the conditions. We grab our account object. We're looking at the account ID that equals the record ID, literally the record that was just shipped to us from the process builder. That's how we know it's the right one. And then what do we want to do? We want to take the status field. And if I delete this, right, you look basically what this allows us to do since we grabbed the account object. It allows me to look for all fields on the account and like what one you want to grab and how you want to update it. So in our case, we want the status one. And if I erase that, it actually pops that up for you. It says, oh, this field has 3 different values. Do you want to update it to one of these? Yep, we do. We want to update it to the queued to activate. So pretty straightforward, right? We have that queued now. Afterwards, we're going to move this over to our pause. And that's kind of the entire point of this video. So let's jump into this one and figure out what this thing is doing. The pause element, in my opinion, is very similar to the decision element. So if you haven't watched the decision element, jump over there and watch that one because it's going to work very similar. You have different paths that you can choose and build out. You have different conditions that you can choose to build out. So I'm not going to try to spend a ton of time on that since that's almost hand in hand like what you would do on a decision element. So jump back over to that one if you want to check that out. So I'll lightly go over them and then focus in on how this one specifically is involved. Once again, going back to our labels within flows, I would always recommend when you're planning out your process automation, like I did on a Google Sheet or on a notebook piece of paper or whatever it is, try to figure out if this is brand new for you in your org. If it's brand new, highly recommend coming up with some type of naming conventions that you're going to use from today for the rest of the time. Because what's really crappy for somebody to do is they get into a flow or they get into an org and what's in there. There's like all these different names and this does that and why is it named this? And that doesn't really make sense to me. So that can happen and it makes it difficult to manage those. So just come up with a naming convention or come up with something that everybody can agree on that makes sense to them. So the label part of these things are just basically what makes sense to you. Like you can name them whatever you want. They're not really doing anything other than giving you a reference to what happened. So in our case, ready to activate makes sense to me because when I want the pause to be done and move on to the rest of the flow, well, ready to activate means it's ready to activate and it's ready to move on, right? So I've named it ready to activate. Our pause conditions here, we don't really need anything in our business use case because every single account needs to get paused for 24 hours. If they get moved, that activate field gets moved to yes, well, then we got to pause it. Like it's got to pause the 24 hours so that finance has that 24-hour SLA to get everything that they need set up. So ours is always going to pause. If your business use case that you're watching this video for doesn't have that, like there's a reason that you would want to pause it, well, you can set that up. Just kind of like our decision element, right? Like you can say all conditions are met, any condition is met, custom conditions are met, and then you'll go through that and you'll set up your resources and what that condition is, what that logic is. In our case, like I said, since we don't need it, not really going to touch on that a ton. We're just keeping ours at no conditions. The resume event, though, this one obviously has to be filled out because we need to understand it's going to get paused, but then when do we actually need this to actually move on? When do we need it to head on over to the rest of the flow and finish everything out? And in our case, it's the 24 hours, right? So we have this set to 24 hours. And that's when we want this thing to actually resume and move to the rest of our elements. So breaking that down, you can choose a specified time. You can choose a platform event message is received. In our case, we want a specified time. We want to choose a specific time. And this piece here, the base time, like what that is, well, in order for the pause element to understand what 24 hours means, it has to have the base time. It has to have a time where it says, okay, from this point on, start counting 24 hours. Or from this point on, count 5 days. Or from this point on, count 6 weeks, whatever it was, right? That's what this base time does. So in our case, we chose, if you saw that, when you go in here, there's something called global variables, and you can actually click into it. In here, it will find some basic stuff like your time. So we can grab the current date time, and that's what we want to use as our base time. So how that's calculated, what the flow dot current date time thing represents that I just clicked, it means as soon as this hits the pause, it's going to stamp that with the current date and time. And then that is actually used as our base to actually start counting the 24 hours, right? So that works perfect for us. That's when we want it to start counting the time. So, and a lot of these use cases, when you look into them, they typically use this. So it's not uncommon to see this. It's like an easy way to grab your basic time to say, all right, cool. Like the flow happened. Let's move on from here. So that's what we're doing. We're grabbing that current date time from when the pause element is hit or from when the flow is basically started. And then we're going to take 24 hours. And then in 24 hours, we'll resume this event. We'll resume back to the flow. So obviously I can keep it 24 hours, right? I'm going to kind of show you the other trick of this, which is we're not actually in this video, right? We're not going to wait 24 freaking hours for this thing to go through. Like we're just going to show you that this works and all that. So I'm not interested in 24 hours for the sake of the video. So how do I get it lower than that? Well, if you change this to 0 and you keep it at hours, this is roughly like a minute. So it'll take it down to a minute. From what I've read on blogs and forums and stuff like that, it's not super consistent from what people have complained about of being like exactly 60 seconds. It ranges a little bit of around that minute mark. So if you need it super consistent down to the second, consider that, but more or less it's around a minute. So if you're okay with that time frame being a little loose like that, you can do it this way. So we'll set it to 0. We want it to be hours. As a heads up, if I spell this wrong, if I spell it like that, actually we'll kick it back in air. So you have to have it spelled either like that or like that. So in our case, let's move to hours. Great. So now this is I'm like stumbling on my words there. This is now going to kick off in like less than a minute. As far as the values and the variables go, we don't need anything in there. We don't need like to store our resume time variable. We don't need to store an event delivery status or anything like that. This one's like cut dry, really simple to go with. So we're actually done with the pause element. That's what this does. So let's hit done. And as you noticed earlier, when I pointed out, there's those paths, right, that you can create. So it's actually asking me like, what do you want it to do? At what point do you want it to move to this next element? And in our case, we want it to move to the update records when it's ready to activate. Or in other words, when the 24 hours is up, we want it to move to the update records. So we're going to use that path. And then from here, this one's just doing the same thing as the first one. We went to our account. We're looking at that record ID that was passed in as our condition. And then we're going back over to that same status field. And just like I did the first time, I want it to actually get moved to activated so that we know that it's been 24 hours and it's ready to roll. So we'll save that. This is activated. Let's check our process builder is activated. And let's refresh our page here. All right, cool. So let's move this on into yes. And what we should see happen is the status gets moved to queued. Cool, and it did. So that's how we know that this is at least working, right? Like it hit the flow because part of our flow was to move this to queued. So that worked. So now if I quickly refresh, it should not have changed because we want it to be roughly around a minute, which it didn't. So that's working too. So while we wait, I just wanted to touch over here. Another great place to go outside of these videos, chances are you probably found that, or this page here. If you haven't, Salesforce has almost anything. I would probably say everything. I just haven't looked through it enough, right? Like that you're interested in, anything within Salesforce is out here that you can check into. So for our specific element, I just Googled, Salesforce Flow element pause, and then this thing will pop up. And then within here, I have different things, right? Like letting me know that it had to be like an auto launch flow. You can check out samples in here. It will give you some more of those complex ones maybe you're after. This is like more of a business use case you could use this in that's not super simple. So feel free to check this place out. It's a good place to build upon this video for more complex matters and where you can find that. All right, let's jump back over here. It's probably been roughly a minute. I should be able to refresh. And it did, right? So it moved to activated. So that's how the pause element works. Is you saw it, like we made an update, it paused it for a specific period of time. That time was up. It then moved it through the rest of the flow and allowed us to get those updates that we needed.